Okay, folks, good afternoon. Hopefully you had a decent lunch. Before we get into talking some more about Chapter 18, let's spend a few minutes talking about the exam on Wednesday and then a little bit about the plan for tomorrow. So first, let me say a couple of words about the exam on Wednesday because I know some of you might want to get a head start on getting ready for the exam tonight. So what's going to be on the exam? What's the setup going to be? um, the exam is going to be worth 130 points. So it's going to be worth more points than your typical midterm, which was worth 100 points. Of that 130, half of it is going to be on new material and half of it's going to be review. Okay, so 65 points on new material, 65 points on review material. Let's talk about the new material first. It will cover basically just 3 chapters. Chapter 15 and 16 on monetary policy and inflation, and Chapter 18 on international macro. So you can see there's actually not a ton of material to be covered on the new part of the exam. And so I think this actually creates an opportunity to do well on this part of the exam. There's not a great deal of new material to cover. A lot of what we talked about in 15 and 16 is actually related to what we talked about in terms of aggregate demand, aggregate supply. So, really there's not a great deal of like new stuff there. So I do think that creates a possibility of doing well on the material, on the new material. And then these other 65 points of the exam is review, okay? So what will this review part of the exam look like? I basically sat down and kind of made a list of 10, 12 things that I thought were really important concepts for you to get out of this class. And then I'm going to ask you questions about 8 or 10 of them, right? So, I mean, that's basically how I did this. So in terms of, thinking about what you should study, you want to focus on the big picture things that we've talked about throughout the block. For instance, things relate to those big 6 questions that we talk about on the syllabus, right? Those are that, I'm not really going to be focusing on like little nitpicky stuff that, we talked about one time and then never came back to, but it's really things that I think that we've come back to again and again that I really want to ask you questions about. And so if it's important enough to show up on the final, you can almost be assured that it's been important enough to show up on previous exams or previous quizzes. And so I really think that a good way to study for the review part of this exam is, well, let me back up. A not so great way to study for the review part of this exam is to go back and open up your notes and look at page 1 and be like page 1, page 2, page 3, and just flip through all your pages. That's not a particularly effective use of your time. What I would do is I would start by going back and looking at my exams and my quizzes, seeing where I made mistakes, or looking at things that maybe I didn't quite understand the first time, and then maybe go back to that part of your notes, right? Maybe spend a little bit of time looking over definitions and things like that, particularly definitions that you've seen before on exams or quizzes. So in other words, do kind of a targeted review that focuses on big things that we've talked about before, things that you've been asked about before. So I think that is definitely going to be one of the things that's going to be the most productive way for you to spend your time studying for the review part of this. I would say maybe one other thing that you can think about in terms of review is, given that now it's kind of at the end of class, this is an opportunity for me to ask you some questions that might pertain to the entire class from beginning to end, right? So not so much a question that's just pertaining to one part of the class, but once again, ideas or concepts that we've talked about throughout the class, to ask you questions about that. Do not, though, spend all of your time thinking about or studying for the review part of the exam, because remember, that's only going to be half of this exam. The other half is going to be the new material. And so, I really do think that there is opportunities to do well on both parts of this exam, right? There's opportunity to do well on the review part, because I think a lot of this should be familiar, because we're going to really go back and hit a lot of topics that we've talked about before. And there should be opportunity to do well on the new part, because there's just not as much material. And I don't think in general, what we've talked about here over the last 3 or 4 days has been as complicated. And so, once again, I think there's really an opportunity to do well on the final. So does anybody have any questions about the final, the structure? I'll say one other thing about the final is that while it's worth 130 points and it will be longer in terms of more questions, I don't really think it's going to be dramatically longer in terms of how much time it should take you. So, once again, we'll plan on going from 9 to 11:30. That's been plenty of time for all of you up to this point, or for most of you up to this point. And so we'll kind of essentially go through the same thing. I mean, I guess now that I think about it, I'll stretch it to noon. So I'll give you till noon. So I'll give you a little bit extra time. But I think for most of you, this exam is not going to take a great deal more time than the midterms did. Okay, so I don't, I think there are some more questions, but in many ways, I don't think it's it's going to be more time-consuming exam. My light is going out here. Okay, so did anybody have any questions about the logistics, the form, what kind of to expect? Once again, on Wednesday, I'll expect everybody to be there in person, unless you're of course taking the entire class off campus, or unless you talk to me. So I'll expect you all to be there in person.
Hey Todd, do you have any
questions about the exam?
Yes.
Okay, so then what will be going on tomorrow? Tomorrow I will give you back your homework number 5. We'll go over that. We'll finish up what we don't get through in chapter 18, and then after that, we will have some time for review in the morning. Okay, so as I said this morning, we won't have, or I'm not planning on having afternoon class. I'd prefer not to have afternoon class. So my hope is that we can get through chapter 18, and then we'll also have time to review for the final exam tomorrow. So, Max, did you have a question?
Yes. Can you hear me? I don't.
Max? Where's Max?
Here.
No, I can't hear you, Max.
Can anyone else?
No, I can hear you. Sorry, it was. Sorry.
So I was wondering if you could give us the keys for the previous test, because I know if I was referring off of my answers, it would not help me for the final exam.
No, and that's the reason why we went over the exams in class. So if you do have questions, you can either reach out to me individually, or I've been recording those, so you can go back and look over our discussion of the previous exams. But that's why I went over in the class.
All right, I'll just go with the reviews. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, anything else? Okay, well, without further ado, let's get into the day. Now, 5 minutes ago, my iPad was working. Let's see if it's still working. Voila. It's just, you guys are getting sick and tired of me complaining about technology, so I won't do it very much longer, but you just gotta let me vent for a second and say, it's just inevitable. It's just so perplexing to me why technology is working. Like when I go home and it works, and I take it to Cornell and it doesn't. There's some sort of I don't know, like third or fifth or 10th dimension on Cornell's campus that crap doesn't work. But okay. There, I got that off my chest. Now I'm ready to go. So what are we going to talk about this afternoon? I want to spend a little bit of time talking about exchange rates. This is really the last big topic in chapter 18, and in many ways the last big topic of this class. Is talk a little bit about exchange rates. What are they? Where do they come from? That's what determines exchange rates. That's going to be kind of our focus this afternoon. And then tomorrow we'll talk a little bit about the role of central banks in managing exchange rates. So let's talk about exchange rates. Exchange rates are determined in what's called the foreign exchange market. Often referred to as the FX market. This is the largest financial market in the world. To give you some idea, this is between $1 and $2 trillion a day is traded in these financial markets. Minimum transactions in these foreign exchange markets are usually a minimum of $1 million. Okay, so these are huge financial markets. Where is it located? Well, it's not located anywhere, right? This is basically a network of dealers, right? Dealers often associated with major banks and other financial institutions that have departments in which people make trades. Most of these trades are electronic, right? And so there's no physical location for this. It's just a network of traders, right, who trade currencies. And so that is what an exchange rate is, right? An exchange rate is just simply the price of one currency in terms of another currency. Right? So for instance, if we were talking about the dollar exchange rate, what is the dollar exchange rate? Well, there's multiple exchange rates, but if we were doing it in terms of euros, that would be $1 exchange rate, the number of euros you get per dollar, right? So the dollar exchange rate is basically the number of euros you get per dollar. So right now, I didn't look at this before class, but this is something on the order of 0.9. So in other words, you get 0.9 euros for every dollar, roughly, right? Roughly. What's the euro exchange rate in dollars?
Dollar over euro.
Yeah, exactly. It's dollar over euro, which is 1 over 0.9 or 1.11, right? So these are just inverses of each other, right? These are just inverses of each other. And in general, newspapers will not report both of these. They will report one of these expecting that you're smart enough to figure out what the other one is, right? In other words, expecting you're smart enough to just take the inverse of it, right? What happens if, and let me back up just to make sure we have some notation. Your book, because we typically are talking about the US case, your book will usually call this the XR, right? XR is the dollar, the price of the dollar in terms of another currency. And so this would be 1 over XR. Okay? Now, the most important thing to understand about an exchange rate is it's just a price. Okay? It is just a price. There's really nothing particularly distinct about exchange rates. Just like cars have prices and tables have prices, currency has prices in terms of another currency. And so really, to understand exchange rates, all you have to do is apply supply and demand, right? You can think about the foreign exchange market for, let's say, given we're talking about the US in general, for dollars. And you really have to think about this as a big market where there's a demand for dollars, there's a supply of dollars, and it's that supply and demand that determines the equilibrium exchange rate. This is a market that is well described by a perfectly competitive framework, right? As I said, there are a large number of buyers and sellers here, right? There's from all over the world, people are buying and selling dollars. There's a homogenous good, dollars. One dollar is the same as another dollar. And everybody's a price taker. Because this market is so big, there's really nobody that's big enough to really influence prices, at least not directly. And so this is really well described by just kind of a very simple supply and demand framework, right? It's just a very simple supply and demand framework. And so what kind of things influence the dollar exchange rate? Well, two things. Things that shift the demand for dollars. So let's talk about some of the things that shift the demand for dollars. One of the things that shifts the demand for dollars is clearly interest rates. Interest rates in the US relative to other countries. And the key here is this word relative. Because if interest rates go up in the US and interest rates go up everywhere in the world, that's not going to change anything. It's only when interest rates change in the US relative to other countries are you going to begin to see some movements in the value of the dollar. So let's think about an example here. Let's say that interest rates rise in the US. How's that going to impact the value of the dollar? Well, it's going to change the demand for dollars. Does this make holding dollars more attractive or less attractive?
Less.
I hear a less. I'm not writing it down. What does that tell you? No, it makes it more attractive. More attractive. Why? Because what can you do with that dollar? Now you could put it in a US bank. You could put it in a US bond. You could put it in any sort of interest-bearing account and begin to earn a higher return on it. So higher interest rates in the US are going to increase the demand for dollars and dollar assets. That's the key, right? That's the key. When interest rates go up in the US, it actually makes the US a more attractive place to save. It's a more attractive place. So you're going to have capital inflows. Capital is going to want to go into the United States where it can get a higher return. So if this is the market for dollars, what's going to happen? The demand for dollars goes up. And as a result, the exchange rate goes up. And using the lingo, we usually call this an appreciation, right? The dollar appreciates. So in this case, when interest rates go up, the dollar appreciates. once again, this is the same result you get if interest rates go down in the rest of the world, because what matters is the relative interest rate, okay? So if interest rates go up in the US, it's the same as if interest rates go down in the rest of the world, or they go down in Europe, or they go down in Canada, right? So the key to this is the relative interest rate, right? Relative interest rate. So one of the things that is followed extremely closely in foreign exchange markets is interest rates, right? Interest rates, it's not number one, but it's, we're going to talk about what the number one thing is that drives movements in interest rates, or that drives movements in exchange rates, but it is very closely followed, right? This is one of the big factors that determines interest rates. And once again, not just interest rates in the US, but interest rates across the world are going to impact the value of the dollar, right? And so, what happens anywhere in the world is going to have some impact on the value of the dollar, because these are international markets. Something else that might impact the value of the dollar is just risk. The risk of US assets. For instance, the recession in the US that's worse than in the rest of the world, right? What would this do to the value of the dollar? Well, this is obviously an increase in risk, right? If the recession goes down, buying a US bond or buying US assets, they look riskier. And so this is likely to reduce the demand for the dollar. And if the demand for the dollar goes down, what's going to happen? The dollar is going to depreciate. What's happened to the dollar recently? Anybody know if it's been going up or down? It's been going up, right? Particularly strongly against European economies. Why? Probably the number one factor is that the US economy is doing better than the rest of the world. That's not to say we're doing great, but once again, everything in this market is relative, right? It's relative to the rest of the world. So while the US economy hasn't been doing great, it's been doing better than Europe. And so the dollar is much stronger against most European currencies because of this, right? It's stronger against the British pound. It's stronger against the euro. A lot of that has been driven by risk. That yes, the US economy doesn't look so great, but it looks a lot stronger than the European economy. And the US financial market looks stronger than the European financial markets. The third factor, and by the way, I want to be clear, there's lots of different things that could impact exchange rates, but I want to really focus on three, right? And so we've talked about interest rates, we've talked about risk, but then there's a very important one, and of all of them, this is the one that's probably the most important, and that is differences in interest rates. I'm sorry, differences in inflation rates. Differences in inflation rates between countries play a big role in what's happening to exchange rates. Okay, so let's think about this. When we've been talking about exchange rates, what we've been talking about is essentially a nominal exchange rate. Right? It's the price of one currency in terms of another currency. But that really only gives us kind of a misleading picture about what's going on in terms of the price of actual goods. Because what's the problem with nominal exchange rates? It's not adjusted for differences in inflation. Right? If we're going to have a true picture of how much goods cost between countries, we need to have some adjustment for the differences in the price level, right? Differences in the price level. You just can't go to Europe and say, oh, that's 100 euros. Well, and it's $90 in the US, 100 is greater than 90, so I better buy it in the US. That doesn't make any sense, right? And you have to adjust for differences in the price level, right? You have to think about the real value of what that 100 euros can buy you versus the real value of what $90 can buy you. And so that's what we call a real exchange rate. Right? And what a real exchange rate is it's adjusted. It's the exchange rate that's adjusted for differences in the price level. Okay? It's adjusted for differences in the price level between countries. How do you calculate the real exchange rate? It's actually relatively simple. You just take the nominal exchange rate and you adjust for the relative price level. You adjust the nominal exchange rate to account for differences in the relative price level. Okay, so think about this example. Okay, let's say that you're interested in the real exchange rate between the US and Mexico. And so you go out there and you find that the nominal exchange rate, meaning the number of pesos per dollar, is equal to 19. Okay, so the current exchange rate is 19 pesos per dollar. You go out and you look at the price level, meaning some basket of goods, like the consumer price index, and you find that this basket of goods in the US costs $100. This same basket of goods in Mexico costs 1,400 pesos. What's the real exchange rate? The real exchange rate is the nominal exchange rate, meaning 19 pesos per dollar, divided by that ratio of prices in the US to prices in pesos. Notice here that these all cancel out, right? These units all cancel out. And so what do you get? $1,900 divided by 1,400, or what is that? I don't have my calculator on me. Anybody got a calculator there?
19 divided by
1.35.
1.35, that sounds right.
result from the
Okay, 1.35. What does this mean? What this means is that goods in the US are more expensive. If the real exchange rate is greater than 1, it means goods are in the US are more expensive. And what would it mean if they were less than 1? Well, it would mean that goods in the US are cheaper than they are in Mexico. Okay, I don't know if any of you have ever traveled abroad. Hopefully you have. If you've traveled abroad, you've calculated real exchange rates. You just have probably never called it a real exchange rate in your mind, but you've calculated this in your head, right? If you go up to Toronto on a weekend and you see a sweater in Toronto and it's 80 Canadian dollars, what's the first thing you do? You say, well, it's 80 Canadian dollars, so I need to convert that into US dollars, which is 70 US dollars. And then I think about, well, could I buy this same sweater for 70 bucks in the US? If it would be more expensive than that in the US, then I'll buy it in Canada. And if it's cheaper than that in Canada, then I'll buy it there, right? What you're doing is you're calculating a real exchange rate. You never called it that. You didn't sit down with a piece of paper and calculate it, but that's essentially what you've done, right? You've compared the real cost of goods in Canada to the real cost of goods in the US. And that's all a real exchange rate is it's really just a means of comparing the price of one goods in one country or another, right? So for instance, look at this, look at a little data here between the US and Mexico. This is looking at the exchange rate. The light blue line is the nominal exchange rate over time. So in other words, over time, you have to give more and more pesos per dollar. Over time, you have to give more and more pesos per dollar. So the peso is depreciating versus the dollar over time here because you're getting more and more pesos per dollar. But the dark blue line is the real exchange rate. And notice how that's flat, right? Notice how that's flat. What does this tell us? This tells us that why is the peso depreciating against the dollar? Because the price level is changing at a different rate than the US price level, right? So when price levels between two countries change at different rates, you're going to get changes in the nominal exchange rate. In fact, we can take this one step further and say they should change in a very predictable way. And this is the concept of what economists call purchasing power parity. The price of similar goods should be the same across, not time, sorry. I don't know why I wrote that. The price of similar goods should be the same across countries, or else people will arbitrage. I don't know if you know what arbitrage means. Arbitrage is just a fancy word for shop, okay? Arbitrage is a fancy word for taking advantage of price differences. And so people will take advantage of price differences if the price of similar goods are not the same between countries. So, you know, just to kind of think of a hypothetical example, what happens if everything was cheaper in Canada relative to the US? What would people do? They'd go up to Canada, buy goods, and bring them back to the US. But of course, if everybody does that, what's it going to begin to do to the exchange rate? It's going to drive up the value of the Canadian dollar, drive down the value of the US dollar, make Canadian goods more expensive, US goods cheaper, and get rid of that price difference. So the idea behind purchasing power parity is that in the long run, prices between countries should be pretty much the same. In other words, what should be true about real exchange rates? The real exchange rate should be 1 in the long run. In other words, the same good should, in real terms, be just exactly the same between countries. And then, remember, if the real exchange rate is equal to 1, remember that's equal to the nominal exchange rate times the price level in the US divided by the price level in the foreign country. Or, to flip this around, what should be the primary thing that determines the nominal exchange rate? Differences in the price level. Differences in the price level should be the main thing that determines the nominal exchange rate. That's the main thing that determines the nominal exchange rate, is just differences in inflation. So what happens if inflation's higher than Mexico? Well, use this formula. If inflation's higher in Mexico than it is in the US, what's going to happen here to this ratio? Prices are going to go up a lot in Mexico and a little bit in the US. Right? And so what's going to happen to the nominal exchange rate for the US? It will go up. The dollar will appreciate, the peso will depreciate. If inflation is higher in Mexico, what's going to happen to the peso? It's going to go down relative to the dollar. That's the big thing that determines exchange rates. That's the big thing, differences in inflation. So in other words, when we see a country that its currency tends to appreciate against other countries, what does that mean? It's a low inflation country, right? Low inflation countries tend to see their currency appreciate. Low inflation countries tend to see their currency appreciate. Vice versa, high inflation countries tend to see their currencies depreciate. So this is a big insight into exchange rates. I mean, in fact, this is the biggest insight. If you need to know one thing about exchange rates and why they move, that one thing is inflation. In general, the biggest thing that moves exchange rates is differences in inflation. Countries that have low inflation tend to see their currency appreciate. Countries that have high inflation tend to see it depreciate. So for instance, over the long term, the dollar tends to appreciate against the peso, right? I think I just showed you some data here, a figure that shows exactly this. Notice that you're getting more dollars per peso over time. The dollar is appreciating. Why? Because inflation is higher in Mexico than it is in the United States. Vice versa, I don't have a graph for this, but if you looked at the dollar versus the Japanese yen, you see the opposite, that the dollar tends to depreciate against the Japanese yen. Why? Because Japan has lower inflation than the US, okay? So just knowing that, just knowing inflation rates, you are going to know a lot about long-run movements in the exchange rate. Does purchasing power parity hold in the real world? Is it true that the price of similar goods are the same across countries? Well, yes, but not perfect, right? Here's looking at the Canadian dollar versus the US dollar. Notice that you see the nominal exchange rate kind of moving all over the place. But the blue exchange rate is the purchasing power parity exchange rate, basically the real exchange rate. Now, is the real exchange rate equal to 1? No, you notice that it's kind of close to 1.2. So it's close to 1, but it's not exactly 1. So, how are you supposed to interpret that? Well, purchasing power parity is a pretty good description of the world, but it's not perfect. And, why isn't it perfect? Well, it's not perfect because in general, you can't arbitrage quite as nicely as this theory suggests. So purchasing power parity holds roughly, but it doesn't hold perfectly. Why? Well, I think maybe one way to think about this is purchasing power parity shouldn't just hold between countries, it should hold within countries as well. Is there purchasing power parity between Mount Vernon and Chicago? Do the price of similar goods, are they the same in Chicago as they are in Mount Vernon? Well, for a lot of things they are, right? For a lot of things, there are not big price differences between Mount Vernon and Chicago. But for some things, there's big price differences, right? What's the number one thing where there's a big price difference between Mount Vernon and Chicago?
Yes.
There's a little,
Housing.
what, yeah, housing, right? Housing's the big one, right? Why? Not everything is tradable. Not everything is movable. Why is housing so much more expensive in Chicago? Because you can't really move land from Chicago to Mount Vernon and vice versa, right? I mean, if people could, they would take land and move it to downtown Chicago, but you can't do that. And so as a result, it's not going to be subject to it's not going to be subject to the powers of purchasing power parity. In other words, arbitrage, people shopping around and moving goods around, is not going to be as effective. Somebody mentioned gas. Why is gas? I mean, gas is not radically more expensive in Chicago, but it is more expensive. Why is gas more expensive in Chicago? Biggest factor is taxes, right? That's the biggest factor between Iowa and Illinois, is that Iowa has much higher fuel taxes. Iowa actually has low taxes, and we also subsidize our fuel through ethanol. So Iowa has cheap fuel, largely because of government policy. So the fact that there's government subsidies and taxes sometimes distorts purchasing power parity. There's also another reason why gas is more expensive in Illinois. Could people get around these taxes? Sure, you could go buy gas in Iowa and take it back to Illinois. What's the problem with that? Like, if you live in Chicago, what's the problem of driving to Iowa to fill up your tank?
You like waste your tank on your drive back, basically.
Exactly, right? You're going to waste in other words, there's transaction costs, particularly transportation costs that you have to think about. So, if everything was cheaper in Canada, that doesn't mean that I'm going to drive up to Canada to do my grocery shopping, because it's just still not going to be worth my time. And so as a result, you got to think about, and then other times there's just barriers between countries. You can't simply move goods because of there's no trade agreement between countries. So for instance, you wouldn't expect purchasing power parity to hold very well between the US and North Korea, because there's lots of barriers of moving goods between the US and North Korea. So purchasing power parity is not, you have to think about this as like a rough approximation of the world, right? Having said that, being an economist, right? And I'm kind of an avid traveler. So, as I've traveled around, I pay attention to these kind of things, right? So it's always interesting to me to kind of think about like a can of Coke and to pay attention to what a can of Coke costs. And interestingly enough, pretty much wherever you go in the world, it doesn't cost that much difference in Botswana or in Nepal as it does in the US. So for goods that can be moved around pretty easily, that don't have high taxes, that don't have huge transport costs, or there's trade barriers, yeah, purchasing power parity is a pretty good description of the world. The key, though, to understanding purchasing power parity is what it says about inflation, right? Because it tells us why inflation is it's the third thing we talked about, but it's the number one thing that influences exchange rates, right? Differences in inflation. Differences in inflation, differences of risk, and differences in interest rates. Those are the three big things that drive the demand for dollars and drive exchange rate movements. things, right? Those are the three big. There's also a fourth thing. This is something that shifts the supply of dollars. And this is monetary policy. Monetary policy is the number one thing that shifts the supply of dollars. And let's talk about this tomorrow, right? So we're not going to get into this afternoon, but this is really where we're going to pick up tomorrow and talk about, right, given we've talked about things that shift the demand for dollars, now let's talk about things that shift the supply, particularly monetary policy. Before I let you go, I just do want to talk about just one last thing. And this is just kind of a way that people talk about exchange rates that I think we should think about. There's definitely this perception in the public and the news that a strong dollar is good for the US, right? When the dollar appreciates, we celebrate. And when the dollar depreciates, then we feel bad about it. Is that the way that we should respond to hearing that the dollar has appreciated or depreciated? Absolutely not. Because what does it mean when the dollar appreciates? Well, it doesn't really mean much in the sense that, yes, it's good for some people and it's bad for other people, but that doesn't mean that it really has any meaning outside of that, right? What happens when the dollar appreciates? Well, what does that do? It makes US exports more expensive. When the dollar appreciates, now you're getting fewer dollars for foreign currency. It makes US exports more expensive. It tends to hurt US exports. Vice versa, it tends to make US imports cheaper. Tends to increase US imports. It tends to make US assets more valuable. But then it tends to hurt Americans that own foreign assets. So here's the point I'm trying to make. Is an appreciation of the dollar a good thing? Depends who you are. It depends who you are. It's a good thing and a bad thing. It's neither. It's neither. Have you ever seen anybody go to the grocery store and say, wow, the price of the apples is really strong? Yeah, price of apples is strong. That's good for us. That's good for the country. No, you never hear anybody say that because why would you think that it matters that the price of apples is strong? It's not strong. Prices go up or they go down. That's the same with the same way you have to think about the exchange rates, right? The price of the dollar goes up, it goes down. It's not strong or weak in the sense that when people use the word strong or weak, it's like they're talking about our national manhood, right? We want a strong manhood, or we're having a weak, right, personhood. That's a ridiculous way to think about it, right? Prices go up, prices go down. You have to think about exchange rates in the same way. So a higher exchange rate of the dollar, an appreciation of the dollar, is neither all good nor all bad. It depends who you are, right? In many cases, a depreciation of the dollar is quite welcomed, right? Because a depreciation of a dollar, if you turn this around, it tends to make US exports cheaper. It tends to help US exports. So people in the export industry actually prefer what you could call a weaker dollar, right? They would prefer a lower dollar. The main thing I don't want us to fall into is this trap of thinking that somehow it's good if the dollar always goes up in value, or it's bad if the dollar always goes down in value. No, it's neither good nor bad. It's just a price, right? And when prices go up, that helps some people and hurts other people. And when prices go down, it helps some people and hurts other people, right? So it should never be the goal of monetary policy or the goal of exchange rate policy to, make your currency strong or to make it weak. And when you hear policymakers or politicians talking that way, it really tells you they don't really quite understand what they're talking about, quite honestly, again. And so, not to keep on mentioning a guy's name and to pick on one party, but, it's hard not to talk about him. Donald Trump, the last 4 years, spent a lot of time talking about how he wanted a strong dollar. Well, first off, I don't know what a strong dollar means, but the idea that he thought you could have a strong dollar, but also reduce the trade deficit, well, that doesn't make much sense, right? Because what's a strong dollar going to do? A strong dollar is going to decrease US exports and increase imports and weaken our trade deficit, worsen our trade deficit. So, the fact that he and other politicians talk about wanting to have a strong dollar on one hand, but wanting to reduce the trade deficit on the other hand, once again, they don't understand those two concepts don't go together, right? They don't go together. And so, just be wary, right? If you hear somebody talking about a strong dollar or a weak dollar, oftentimes that's just kind of they're kind of just using buzzwords without really quite understanding everything that goes into this. Okay, so I think that's probably a pretty good point to stop. So the main thing we want to talk about tomorrow is to talk about how central banks can manage exchange rates, right? How central banks can manage exchange rates. So I think we probably have about an hour's worth of material to cover tomorrow. And so, as I said, we will cover that material in the morning, and then we'll spend the rest of afternoon class just kind of an opportunity for you to ask questions or anything else about the exam. So, okay, we all good with that? Okay, well, if so, have a good afternoon, and see you back 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. Have a good one.